Morning, everybody, and happy Monday. This is week 4. Time is going by really, really fast. And we have a lot of material. I didn't realize this chapter 5 on governments is probably one of the longest in the book because there's a lot of unpack about governments, starting from the definition of a government, which is basically the organization of politics within a state. And you have to notice that we refer to a government both as the people who are in the government, but also to the type of government that there is. So we talk about democratic government or authoritarian government. It's very important to understand, probably if you have to choose one feature of a government, legitimacy is the one that counts the most. We have a definition of legitimacy, which is, the credibility, the legality of a certain government, and how it draws its authority and gets people to follow it and to think of it as the legitimate government of a certain country. Weber, who is the same guy that we've seen before, political scientist from the late 19th century, early 20th century, created a definition of the state that we've used before, state as the monopoly of violence on a certain territory. He talks about 3 different forms of legitimacy. Very, very briefly, a traditional form of legitimacy is what a king enjoys because it's rooted in traditional institutions, or even the kind of political authority that a bishop has in a certain church. Then you have a type of charismatic legitimacy, which comes from, charisma normally is like a charm, is like the power of words, is coming from being a strong leader, being perceived as a strong leader and as such, or a good public speaker. You can definitely say that both Donald Trump and Barack Obama have a form of charismatic leadership, and so they draw some legitimacy from the way that they speak, even if for some people both of them might also be delegitimated by the way that they speak. And then the third kind is the one that is mostly linked with democracy, and it's the rational legal. Okay, what kind of legitimacy is rational legal? Well, rational is the one that you think rationally that that's your legitimate leader, right? And legal, it just derives from legal institutions. For example, if there are elections give a leader legal kind of legitimization. Okay, legal legitimacy. Without elections, if a ruler is not elected, then they have to count on the other types of legitimacy. The other part that is very important about governments is effectiveness. And effectiveness normally keeps governments in power. Effectiveness is what gets you reelected if you're in a democracy, and it's what keeps you in power if you are a dictator. For example, China. Why has the Chinese regime lasted so long? Why has China stayed under communism, even if communism has changed over time in China? Well, arguably, it's because of the incredible economic growth that the government has been able to create, and that has lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty. China, up until the 70s, was largely agricultural country, a country of peasants, and then now it's a heavily urbanized country. All those people have been lifted out of poverty and now live in cities. And it's the same idea that some people here say that the government is not legitimate in the US because they feel that the government doesn't deliver on the promise of the American dream. Okay, so we have to be careful with the kind of legitimacy that we think about. Very important with all of this is the idea of the rule of law. I never really understood why it's called rule of law and not rule by law, because that would make more sense to me, but in any case. And it's basically the idea that the law, so the constitution and the laws of the country, are the ruler, and they are more important than any king or president or member of parliament. So that everybody in the country has to follow the rules. They have to follow the laws of the country. Today, every country wants to look legitimate, both at home and abroad. And so many countries pretend that they're democracies even when they're not. This is very important because if people think that you're democratic, you are more legitimate in their eyes. And also because on the international scale, democracies like to talk and commerce and do business and write treaties with other democracies, which is why it's so crazy that Trump prefers to talk with Saudi Arabia, North Korea, and Russia instead of talking to the UK and France. But let's take a step back. Let's think about democracy for a second. You probably have seen the definition of the word democracy before. It's from the Greek demokratia, which comes from demos, people, and kratos, rule, power. So, power of the people, rule of the people. Today, we don't just talk about democracy, we talk about liberal democracy, because the values of the ideology of liberalism that we've seen that are about personal freedom have been fused with the Greek ideal of democracy. And so, in our modern democracies, we have elections, we have elected officials, but at the same time, we also have liberal guarantees. No one can come and kidnap you from your house. You have some personal freedom. The other piece that we add to this is liberal representative democracy. Representation is the way to solve the problem that there's simply too many countries here to listen to everybody, too many people in this country to listen to everybody. It's not like you can have 300 million people or however many Americans there are out there and listen to all of their opinions. That would be like being in a madhouse, right? And so it's not enough to vote, to have elections. Elections themselves need to be democratic and representative. If you have a population that's diverse and everybody on your ballot, all the people that you can try to elect are white, then there's a problem. If all the people that you're trying to elect are of the same religion, then again, unless the whole population is of the same religion too, then they're not representative of the population. Okay? So this is a very important aspect of representation. One of the coolest examples that I've ever gotten about the difference between democracy and liberal democracy was made by a guy who was a PhD student when I was a student in Greece in 2012. The name of the guy is Alexander Rapis. He came into one of our classes and gave us an example about the difference between democracy and liberal democracy. He said, do you know that there's a very famous episode in the history of the United States that is about the Salem witch trials? I think this was at the end of the 18th century. And he asked us, do you know how it was decided that the witches of Salem were burnt on the stake? It was decided through a vote. The whole village of Salem, the whole town of Salem voted. And they voted that majority. Okay? The majority decided that the witches should be burnt. Was that vote democratic? He asked the class. And many people in my class said, yeah, it was democratic. And many other people said, no, it's terrible. How could it possibly be democratic? And then he said, is there something that's missing here? And what was missing there was liberal democracy. Was it democratic? Yes, it was certainly democratic. Was it liberal? No, it was not liberal because it didn't protect people from being killed at the whim of the masses.